Somebody pays me a compliment. The feeling of pride arises. It's a strange sensation in the body. I notice it, but it's not targeted at the body. I don't think the body can necessarily feel pride. It's a thought, so it does come and go. But it's obviously targeted at the self, at an egoic self, which actually does feel the pride. So isn't it a behavior that is kind of hardwired into us to feel pride when someone says something good about ourselves? And isn't that so that our thoughts and our body can have feedback so that we do more of that thing and it helps increase our survival? I guess my question is, I'm having a hard time getting rid of it. Not that I should get rid of it, but when I examine it, there does seem to be a target. That target definitely has a feeling. Is that all an illusion? How do I think about the actual feeling of pride when it arises, and how true is it, and how false is it, and how true and false are its targets?
There is a lot of truth in the idea that taking feedback is natural to being a human being. It's very simple to look at something and say, did this work or did it not, and take that feedback and use it to change your actions. The illusory aspect of it comes into play when you attribute the feedback to your ego rather than to your actions. So if you do something successfully, it's not because of your identity, it's not because of your ego, it's simply because you executed it well. It's because you had an understanding of what you were doing and you applied that understanding in a successful manner. It's natural to take pride in what you're doing, but it's not natural to feel pride after having done it.
There is this truth of no self. So an enlightened person is one who sees without a doubt through the illusion of the self, and no self remains. However, how do they, quote unquote, get there in the first place? Because that means the seeker did not exist as a self, which means that there's nothing they could really have done to get to that state or that realization, because there is no doer. And if there's no doer, that means it's all conditioning and environment. So when one becomes enlightened, is that simply because that's just the way the chips fell? There was no other way. It just moved towards that. So if that's the case, then what can one do? There's no one there to do. So what is this whole enlightenment chase anyway?
I find it much easier to understand this if you take the same model and you try to apply it to something else. So if you talk about learning math, for example, and you bring this idea of no self into your pursuit of an understanding of math, it doesn't really apply anywhere. It doesn't have an impact because you still either understand it or you do not, and it has nothing to do with your own perceived identity. It simply has to do with the contents of your mind and whether those contents contain an understanding of mathematics. So in the same way, when you pursue an understanding of yourself, when you pursue spiritual enlightenment, it doesn't require an identity. It doesn't require a pursuer to have a pursuit. But that's one of these illusions that even the grammatical structure of our language perpetuates. The reality is that this is simply a mental hang-up that is not productive in any way to the search for enlightenment. And you can even see this in the other pursuits of your life, like making money, for example. You don't question your free will when it comes to making money. If you're serious about making money, you just figure out a way to do it and you go execute it. So similarly, when someone is serious about seeking enlightenment, they don't really bother so much with the question of whether they have the free will to seek enlightenment or not, because it's an immaterial question. If you don't have the free will to do it, then you'll seek it if you want to, and you won't if you don't want to. So when people want to, they simply seek it. Whereas if you do have free will, you arrive at the same conclusion. So it's a question that doesn't change anything.
James, I love this line of question and answer. And at the same time, I always arrive at the same conclusion. It doesn't matter. And so if it doesn't matter, what is the point? Why do we have the question? Why do we like to philosophize? Why are we curious?
People like to fidget with things. People like to play with things, and it doesn't just apply to physical things, but it applies to ideas as well. Because it's part of the nature of mind that it just enjoys being occupied.